Welcome to All Classic Car and this collection of photographs forming the streets and driveways of the 1970s collection, i.e. cars that you could typically have seen on the roads and driveways and garages during that decade. And we begin with a Mini of 1971-1972. This would be a Mark III with the double gutter, hidden door hinges and wind-up windows. That's followed by a Rover P6, a 2000 TC for twin carburetors. I forget this colour of brown, is it tobacco perhaps? That's followed by a Vauxhall Victor FE Estate. Just the sort of car you would have seen on driveways back in the 1970s. That's followed by a Volvo 122S, a four-door car, same colour as the one we had back in the 1970s, but this is the twin carburetor S version. And to a Welsh scrapyard and a four-door Ford Cortina Mark III. Doesn't look in too bad a condition. I wonder how it ended up in there. And that's followed by something of a rarity from 1974-75. This is an Alfa Romeo Alfetta four-door saloon. Review now of a Capri 3-litre gear. This is probably a Mark III Capri from 1978. Nodding dog on the back window. Of course, a Morris Minor. These were everywhere back in the 1970s. This is a 67 or 1968 version of the Morris Minor 1000. And the Vauxhall Viva HC in the undergrowth. That's followed by a Vauxhall Viva HA. I mean, many of these cars I remember myself from the road that I grew up in back in the 1970s. Here's a Reliant Kitten P-Reg, mid-1970s, August 75 onwards. Somewhat modified, but getting rarer now. The review of a Lancia Beta HPE, a fastback come estate. You could get a Volume X supercharged version of this car. That's followed by a Mark II Ford Consul. These were still around in the early 1970s, getting a bit long in the tooth by then, but they were definitely still in service, many of them. That's followed by an M registration BMW 2002 two-door car, as they all were. And the Morris 1800. A friend of mine's dad had the Austin 1800S, a twin carburetor car. His was a K-Reg. This is N-Reg, so 1974. That's followed by a Mark V Cortina. Cortinas were everywhere, just like the Sierras and the Mondeos were later on, but this is a Ford Cortina Mark V, quite a late one. Staying with Dagenham's finest, this is a Ford Consul Classic two-door saloon, ESV 636. That's a classic car show a few years back. Another friend of mine's mum bought one of these new, S registration, it was bright orange, an Austin Allegro Estate. The car you always promise yourself, it said in the advertising, a Ford Capri Mark I. This is a 1970-71 car. And the Talbot Matra Rancho. This is from the end of the decade, very much so, but echoes of the Land Rover Discovery perhaps going on here, but somewhat before the Land Rover. And a Sunbeam Rapier Fastback, or a pair of them indeed. These were fairly rare back in the day, but you did see them around from time to time. And that's followed by another Roots Group product, a Hillman Super Minx, 1966. And a Wolseley 1660, the big Farinas, they were everywhere. They sold in such great numbers. All the different versions were very common in the 1970s, but they were beginning to show their age. As were the Triumph Heralds. This is a 1965 Herald 1250 with a full-length folding roof. And the Rover SD1. This particular car came from Reed's of Cheadle, which was my local BL dealership back in the 70s, where I used to go and get all the car brochures from. The Triumph Toyota Crown. This is an early 70s car. A neighbour opposite to us, he bought a new 2600 Super Saloon in the late 1970s. Here we've got a brown Triumph 2500S, S4 twin carburetors. That's followed by a Vauxhall Chevette. These used to be everywhere at one time. Review of a Singer Vogue. Of course, this was based on the Hillman Super Minx that we've seen before. This is a late-ish car, 1965, with a squared-off back window. And signs of the Japanese invasion were much in evidence by the time of this car, 1976. This is a Datsun 100A Cherry. That's followed by a Triumph Toledo. Of course, in the 1960s, most of the cars you would have seen in streets and driveways would have been of British manufacture, but as the 70s rolled on, foreign cars were beginning to take more of a hold, as exampled by this S-Reg 1977 Datsun 120A, the F2 Coupe. An A40 Farina Mk1, even though this car was sort of from about 1960 or 61, there was still quite a number of them around in the 1970s, but they were getting a little long in the tooth. And to P registration, 1975, we've got a Ford Escort Mark II two-door. And another Ford, a camper van based on the Transit Mark I. Another good old Farina favourite, this is the Austin Cambridge, the A60 Cambridge from 1966. And the MG 1100, twin carburettors, 1275 engine, a very peppy little car indeed. The Vauxhall Cresta now, this is the PB Cresta, 4-door saloon, 1966. And the French classic now, a Renault 15 GTL, and a rakish coupe of the mid-1970s. Continuing with these classic cars, we've got a Singer Chamois coupe, based on the Hillman Imp, of course, fastback particular styling here. And a good old Ford Cortina, this time a Mark V estate. A Lada. These were quite common with people who wanted cheap and cheerful motoring. This is a Lada 1200 L-Reg 1972-73. That's followed by a Mark I Vauxhall Cavalier, with another one alongside by the look of it. Triumph now, fairly late Triumph Herald. This is a 1360 Saloon, F registration, the 1296cc 4-cylinder engine. And here's BMC's AD016, this is a Morris 1100 from 1964, best-selling car for many years throughout the 1960s, so there were plenty of them around in the 1970s. That's followed by a early to mid-1960s Citroën 2CV. Bit of an oddball here, certainly in this country, an Audi 80 B1, 4-door saloon. Audis were still quite a rare sight back in those days, but not so much now. And that's followed by a Hillman Imp of 1966. Very smart car with a Marcos alongside. And the Zodiac, the Mark III Zephyr Zodiac. Very smart car, quad headlamps for the upmarket Zodiac version. And here's a very similar car, but this is the estate version of the Zephyr Mark III. Cavernous load space, ideal for holidays, plus a tow bar so you could tow a caravan. And here we have a little DAF. I think this is a 66 coupe, probably a marathon coupe. 4-door Ford Escort Mark II next. Very late 1970s example. Quite a posh one with a vinyl roof. And a Renault 4. Quite like these. This is a left-hand drive example seen in Portugal a little while ago. And a Mark II Mini. This is a Morris badged version of the Mini Woody, with the wood on the sides. Not structural, whereas on the Morris Mine of course it was. And the Triumph Dolomite, another very popular car of the 1970s. This is a non-sprint version, so I'm guessing probably a 1500. And a Singer Vogue Estate. These were not all that common even back in the day, and they're certainly rare now. SAAB 96, this is a V4 car from about 1972. The Triumph Vitesse, very smart saloon. Of course you could get the convertible version as well, but this is a saloon version, fairly early example. Morris Miners, of course they were everywhere, so we had to have a Morris Minor Traveller in here somewhere. This looks like a very original example. Probably typical of the condition you would have seen them in the 1970s. And that's followed by a very smart Ford Capri Mark II from 1977 or 1978. Slightly later car alongside. One of BL's finest, the Triumph TR7 Fixed Head Coupe, 1977, 1978. Quite a rakish and affordable little sports car. Another classic French machine now, and a Citroën GS from 1976. The Riley 1.5. Again, so late 50s, early 60s design, but there was still plenty of them soldiering on well into the 1970s, but rust would have been taking a hold by then, as would be the case with this early 1960s Hillman Minx. fairly late example of the Audax series of Minks. That's followed by the Austin Princess. This is a 2200 HL, so fairly near the top of the tree in terms of specification. And a Hillman Hunter. You have the Hillman Minks, the Hillman Hunter, the Singer Vogue, all sharing the same boxy design, if you like. And that's followed by a Renault 5. Most of them weren't the sporty versions like this, but an early-ish Renault 5, so that had to be included here somewhere. And a Hillman Avenger. A neighbour of ours up the road had a silver one of these, possibly coinciding with the Silver Jubilee in 1977. And the mighty Volvo, the monstrous Volvo 244DL. I was never entirely sold on the styling of these, the front end view, but a good solid chunky car. And similar age, this is L registration to 1972 Ford Cortina Mk1 GXL. Top of the tree. A slightly oddball offering now, a Mitsubishi Colt Estate from 1978. Good old Anglia 105E. Plenty of these still around in the 1970s. Look at any old photographs from that era, streets, high streets, garages, etc., and you'll see an Anglia somewhere. Same for the Austin 1300, a K registration, 1971-72, four-door saloon. And the SAAB 900 Turbo, they came out in 1979, so the tail end of the decade we're looking at here. A 2-litre turbocharged car, of course. And a pair of Allegros, an early Mk1 Allegro saloon with the estate in the background. Mk1 Cortina, a gentleman up the road from us used to have a four-door example in dark blue, Mr. Arden. I remember it well, he kept it in immaculate condition. A pair of Vauxhall Viva HBs now, in anything but immaculate condition. This is the Comma van, based on the Hillman Imp, of course. A high roof line to clear the engine that was in the back, of course. And the Vauxhall Victor FB, quite a popular car back in the 1960s, plenty of them were still going in the 1970s, saloons and estates. And the AD016, this is the Riley version of the 1100, the Riley Kestrel, resurrecting a name that originally was used back in the 1930s. A DAF 33, second DAF to feature here. This is an L-Reg car from 1972 or 73. The Fiat 127, again another mate of mine, his mum bought one of these new. It was a yellow example, not quite as jazzy as this one, but definitely a Fiat 127. An Austin Maxi, L-Reg, so a mid-production car, 72, 1973, somewhere around there, with later Austin Ambassador wheels. Very smart now, Simca Estate, K registration, so 71, 72, nice roof rack on there. Staying with classic estates, we've got a VW variant L-Reg, looks in very original condition to me. An immaculate Humber Scepter, again based on the Hillman Super Minks. The difference with these cars and the cars back in the 70s was most of them weren't as shiny as these are now. We've got a Volvo 144, this was a four-door car, the 142, which I'm not sure was ever sold here, had the two doors, but this was a four-door UK market car. The Fiat 124 Coupe, I well remember playing in a scrap one of these that was dumped in a local car park back in the late 1970s. And the Austin Princess, this was a fairly early example, this is P registration, so 1975, 1976. Transverse engine well in view there. Now we have a Ford Cortina Mk2, two-door saloon. Another Cortina and another two-door Cortina. This is a Mark IV this time, R-Reg from 1976. This was at the Tatton Park Classic Car Show some years ago. And at the Western Park Classic Car Show, quite a few years back, was this Morris Marine Estate. Had to be a Marina in here somewhere. Jaguar XJ Coupe, a six-cylinder car. My music teacher at school had a Squadron Blue one of these. Fiat 500. Economy motoring for the masses, of course. This is an L-Reg car. Ford 100E. Even though these were very much a car of the 1950s, there were still quite a few plugging away into the 1970s. A Carman gear. Not often spotted, but they were around. This is a really smart example in orange. This was at a classic car meeting in Crewe. And down at the British Motor Museum there was a big gathering of classic minis a few years ago, and there's this smart Mini Clubman, L registration, 1972. The four-door SAAB 99L. There's one just like that my uncle shoehorned a Dolomite Sprint engine into back in the 1980s. And the rear view of the Ford Corsair. This is a fairly rare Corsair GT on wire wheels. This was at the Western Park Classic Car Show some years back. And a big old Zephyr Zodiac Executive, the Mark IV Zodiac, a monstrous mighty machine, if ever there was one, replaced by the Granada. And another Austin Maxi, again early 1970s example. Carrying on with these cars of the 1970s, we've got a Simca OHC 477M from 1973. I think this is the sporty rally version. And then we've got a Hillman Hunter, or a Hillman Minx rather, Estate. The Arrow series cars, of course. Very practical car, very rarely seen now, and that's followed by Mk1 Ford Escort. A deluxe car, very much a barn find condition. Has it been left like that, or has it been restored? And a Scimitar GTE. This is the SE5 version of the GTE from the early 1970s. A couple of Riley Elfs now, mini based of course. This is an E registration from 1967. And a Citroen CX, not a car you saw all that often in the 1970s, but they were around, and this is a right-hand drive example as well. B603 PGX, that's a Wartburg, the East German two-stroke Wartburg. And staying with such cars, this is a Russian Moskvich. A neighbour of ours up the road, in the road we lived in, bought one of these brand new. It's like a mid-bluey grey colour, so I wanted to include one here. And the gentleman opposite, he bought one of these brand new, a Toyota Celica. His was silver. This one's on Supra wheels by the look of it. And a Renault 17 TS Coupe. Very rakish, sporty, affordable car of the 1970s. This one from 1977-78. And a Sunbeam Rapier convertible towing a car-light caravan. Just the sort of towing combination you might have seen back in the 1970s. Here's the ultimate family car of the era. This is a 1966 Morris Oxford Estate. Staying with classic estates, we've got an Anglia 105E Estate now. Again, very useful. This is a 1965 car. Had plenty of life in it left by the 1970s, and a rear view of a Lotus Elite, the wedge-shaped Lotus Elite. R-Reg, so 1976. Next up, the Ford Fiesta Mk1, or Bobcat, as the project was called internally at Ford back in the 1970s. Very neat little car. And a two-door Ford Escort Mark II that isn't a rally car, becoming increasingly rare. This is quite a late V-Reg example from 1979. And a Mitsubishi Colt Celeste. I can't remember the last time I saw one of these. This is about 1977-78. But very much the kind of car you would have seen driving around on the streets of Britain back in the 1970s. And talking of popular classics, these A35s were still very popular long after they'd gone out of production. Another friend of mine, his dad bought a BMW 3-litre S that was this shape. These are the E3 series saloons. And a Chrysler badged version of the Hillman Avenger Estate. R-Reg, of course, a 1976-1977, very rare now. And then we've got an Opel Ascona, of all things. Very rare car. This was seen quite a few years ago at a classic car show. There's an Allegro VDP alongside. And MGBs were everywhere, of course, in the 1970s. A neighbour of ours had one and backed it into my dad's Volvo. That was a rubber bumper MGB, so it got off quite lightly. And depending where you lived, you may well have had one or two neighbours with an XJS. This is a fairly early XJS V12. But did any of you watching this have a neighbour with an R080, the NSU R080, the Wankel engined car? Rare then, very rare now. As are these. This is a Renault 16 from the late 1960s. A Renault 4 alongside, in fact. Here's a Vauxhall VX490 of 1973 to 1974. MGB alongside. And a Beetle, another neighbour of ours. Back in the 1970s, he brought one of the Jeans limited edition VW Beetles, kept it for many, many years. Rubber bumpers were all the rage at MG in the 1970s, and here we've got an MG Midget 1500, suitably adorned with the big rubber safety bumpers. And staying with brown MGs, we've got an MGB GT with the rubber bumpers, just like the car that backed into Dad's Volvo, albeit that car was blue. VVS 699, that's a Herald 1200 estate, now showing a Sawn on the DVLA database, so is it due to get back on the road anytime soon? And here we have the Austin Allegro Equipe, a sporty, jazzy version of the Austin Allegro. And alongside the same car we've got the VDP, or the Van der Plas 1500 version of the Austin Allegro. So French classics now, we've got a Citroën Amy. This is the Amy 8, I believe. The Amy 6 had the sort of reverse rake rear window. And an Alfa Romeo Alfa Sud Sprint S-Reg, so this would be a 1977 car. This was at an evening classic car meet a few years back. And down at the Malvern Classic Car Show in 2006 was this Ford Granada Mk1 from 1975. Got a 6-cylinder Volvo 164 now. This is a late 60s, circa 1968 example. 3-litre straight 6, based on the 144 Saloon. And to the Haynes Motor Museum briefly, we've got a Honda 600 from the late 1960s. Not that common. The Civic became much more popular in later years, of course. And the Ford Escort Mark 1 van, very much a popular tradesman's vehicle, delivery van of the early to mid-1970s. And staying with Escorts, we have a Mark II Escort 1300 Sport. Very rare example indeed. Two-door bright orange. And the little sunbeams. Top of the tree was the Lotus-powered version, which I think this is, but the standard sunbeams were quite a common sight throughout the 1970s, as were these. This is a Ford Transit Mark II ex-registration, so the back end of the decade, but Transit Mark 1s and 2s were a very common sight in the 1970s, as were these. This is a Renault 12 of the early 70s, circa 1973-74. And a Fiat 126, I think this is a later Polski, Polish-built version, but 126s, another neighbour of ours, had a beige one of these and used to bomb around in it on a daily basis. Let's have another Cortina, Ford Cortina Mark III, 4-door saloon, bright yellow, circa 1973. Another Cortina, this time a 2-door Mark II Ford Cortina of the late 1960s, with an early-ish maxi alongside. A review of the small NSU Prins. This is something of variety then as now. This is a K registration Clan Crusader, based on Hillman Imp running gear. Jaguar XJ Series 2, totally standard early 1970s Series 2 XJ6. Very common sight, but they did rust out quite quickly. And to round out this collection of classics, we've got a Humber Super Snipe of 1967. And the Humber rounds out this collection of 150 photographs featuring the cars, the streets and the driveways of the 1970s, cars that were popular back in that era. Some of them were new, some of them were second-hand. Most of the cars that were in our road in the 1970s as I was growing up were second-hand, so the cars from the 60s onwards would have been quite common still. And I hope that was of interest. Please check out some of the other classic car videos on the channel now. More videos very soon. Thanks for now. Bye bye.